When Ottoman armies claimed victory, the battlefield didn't fall quiet. It transformed into something far more sinister. The defeated men were killed or enslaved, but their wives faced a fate that made death seem merciful. These women weren't simply taken as prisoners. They became merchandise in a machine that stripped them of everything they once were. This wasn't random chaos after battle. It was a calculated system, written into law, executed with cold precision. The Ottomans had perfected something terrible, turning human beings into commodities through official channels. Before we go deeper into this dark chapter of history, join Echoes of History so you never miss our explorations into the past that shaped our world. Under Islamic law, these women had a specific designation, sabaya, meaning spoils of war. The Ottomans enforced this classification with brutal efficiency. The moment a city fell, specially trained officers moved in to divide the population like livestock. Families were torn apart in minutes. Men separated from women, children pulled from mothers, all according to procedure. The wives of fallen warriors underwent something degrading beyond words. Ottoman doctors and officials examined them like animals at auction. They checked teeth, inspected bodies, assessed fertility. Every physical attribute determined their value. Young women with attractive features were marked for the capital. Older women were condemned to backbreaking labor or simply discarded. This was humiliation as industry. A noble woman who once commanded respect could find herself poked and prodded in the public squares. Her worth shouted out like the price of grain. Her body reduced to numbers scribbled in a ledger. The terror didn't end with inspection. Long marches followed, with captives chained together for weeks. Many collapsed from starvation or exhaustion, left dying on roadsides. Others were packed into carts like cargo. Simply surviving the journey was its own brutal ordeal. But what waited at the end was somehow worse. The slave markets of the Ottoman world operated in plain sight. They weren't hidden underground operations. They were legitimate businesses, regulated by the state, taxed by officials. In Constantinople, Bursa, and Ankara, women stood in lines awaiting inspection by potential buyers. These buyers could touch them, examine them, even test their abilities before making offers. A woman's skills were displayed like tools at a hardware stall. Could she sew? Could she weave? Could she cook? If she failed to demonstrate value, she was beaten or her price was lowered. There was no shred of dignity left in the process. The humiliation served a purpose: complete dehumanization. Women were forced to smile under threat. They had to show obedience, to pretend they accepted their new reality. Behind them, scribes recorded everything in meticulous detail: names, origins, ages, prices. These ledgers of suffering filled Ottoman archives, creating permanent records of misery. The most beautiful captives faced the darkest destination, the imperial harems. Forget the romantic myths told in later stories. The harem wasn't about luxury or forbidden love. It was a prison decorated with gold. Inside Topkapi Palace, thousands of women from conquered lands lived in confinement, competing desperately for survival under the watch of eunuch guards. Everything was stripped away: language, faith, even their names. A Christian woman from Hungary or Greece would wake up one day with a new Ottoman name, forced to speak Turkish, forced to practice Islamic rituals. Refusing meant starvation, whipping, or isolation in pitch-black cells. The harem wasn't just about sexual exploitation. It was about psychological destruction. Women fought each other for scraps of influence, knowing that favor from the powerful meant survival, while rejection meant abuse or death. Many couldn't adapt. Some lost their minds completely. Others ended their own lives, unable to bear the torment. The harem wasn't paradise. It was where identities went to die. For wives of important men, the suffering cut even deeper. If their husbands had been commanders or nobles, they were often forced to serve the very officers who had destroyed their families. This degradation was intentional, designed to send a message. If the noble women of your land can be broken, nobody is safe. Resistance would always end in humiliation. The cruelty followed a system. Imperial scribes registered every detail about each woman: her origin, her skills, her appearance, her price. It was bureaucracy turned into dehumanization. To the empire, these women were simply numbers in ledgers, proof of power documented in ink. But the Ottoman machine didn't stop at enslavement. It went further still. Captive women became producers of the next generation of slaves. Any child born to an enslaved mother automatically belonged to the master. Mothers raised children they could never truly claim as their own, knowing the empire could tear them away at any moment. Even the womb became a tool of exploitation. When this wasn't enough, religion became a weapon. Captive Christian women were dragged through forced conversions. These ceremonies had nothing to do with genuine faith and everything to do with domination. Refusal meant torture. Acceptance meant the final severing of all ties to family, culture, and past identity. Conversion made escape meaningless. Even if a woman managed to run, she could never return home. She had been erased legally and spiritually. This is how the Ottomans turned military conquest into permanent domination. The battlefield might last weeks, but the fate of these women stretched across generations. Their bodies became extensions of imperial power. Their children were born into chains. Their identities were systematically obliterated. And this was only half the story. The Ottomans weren't satisfied with private domination. They weaponized humiliation publicly, turning women's suffering into warnings carved into the memory of every conquered people. Forced conversion wasn't about saving souls. It was about breaking them. Women were marched into humiliating rituals where their own priests were absent, their gods mocked, their refusal punished severely. Refused to recite the Islamic declaration of faith and face starvation, whipping, or confinement in darkness. Accept, and the chains sank deeper. A Christian wife became, in the empire's view, a Muslim slave with no path back. Escaping to her old community became impossible. Her family wouldn't recognize her, her church wouldn't take her back. Conversion was a second death, and the Ottomans understood this completely. Destruction was most effective when it was permanent. That's why children became weapons. Enslaved women gave birth to sons and daughters who were never theirs. A newborn wasn't considered the child of the mother, but property of the master. A boy might be raised as a servant, a soldier, or sold into the janissary system. A girl was marked to replace her mother in the same cycle of sale, humiliation, and confinement. Mothers raised children knowing they were raising the next generation of slaves. Their wombs became tools for empire. The records proved the scale. Ottoman scribes meticulously catalogued captured women by name, age, price, and skills. These ledgers piled high in imperial archives, transforming human misery into official documentation. Nothing was random. Every act of brutality was written, stamped, and filed. The empire turned horror into paperwork. For wives of powerful enemies, punishment reached another level. They weren't hidden in markets or harems. They were paraded publicly. This public humiliation broke not just the woman, but the community watching her. She became a living reminder that no rank, no nobility, no bloodline could resist Ottoman power. Resistance did happen, but at a terrible price. Some women attempted escapes, bribing guards, slipping notes to family, or starving themselves to death as their only act of control. But the empire thrived on making examples of those who tried. The Ottomans weren't satisfied controlling just the present. They reshaped entire societies through this system. Whole communities across the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the Middle East were gutted of women. Generations disappeared. Villages lost daughters, mothers, and wives, permanently warping population balances. This was demographic warfare through removal. The scars lasted centuries. Survivors who somehow escaped or were freed carried trauma for life. Some could no longer speak their native language after years of forced assimilation. Others couldn't pray in the religion they once cherished. Many were rejected by their own families, who saw them as tainted. They returned home as strangers, living evidence of what conquest had done to them. Historians once brushed over these details. They wrote of Ottoman military victories, architecture, and administration. They spoke of grandeur and tolerance. But hidden in archives were the receipts of human lives, ledgers filled with the suffering of women whose names were erased. For centuries, their voices were ignored, buried under myths of empire. Only recently, with deeper study of primary sources, has the true scale become undeniable. The efficiency of the system was perhaps its most terrifying feature. This wasn't chaos, it was order. A structured machine of enslavement designed to run smoothly, endlessly, generation after generation. Women became units of value. Their suffering was legitimized by law. Their exploitation was sanctified by ritual. The Ottomans exported this cruelty. Their methods influenced other Islamic states, spreading the precedent of regulated slavery, harems, and forced conversion. What they built became a template that endured for centuries beyond their empire. This wasn't just history. It was a model of how a state can strip away humanity while wearing the mask of civilization. Cannon fire destroyed walls, but bureaucracy destroyed lives. One erased stone, the other erased identity. In this system, no woman was safe. Not noble women, not wives of commanders, not even children born within palace walls. Some women faced punishments so calculated, so sadistic, that even the empire's own records struggled to describe them. These women weren't sold, weren't sent to harems, weren't assigned to kitchens or markets. They were broken in ways designed purely for spectacle. When cities resisted too long, when commanders defied the sultan, their wives were singled out. The empire turned them into living warnings. Punishment began with exposure. Captured women were dragged through streets, chained, beaten, and displayed before their conquered communities. A commander's wife might be stripped and paraded before the very soldiers who had slaughtered her family. Her body became a banner of defeat. Then came branding, hot irons pressed against skin, burning symbols into flesh, not to mark ownership, but to erase dignity. Noble women who once sat beside kings were made to clean floors of Ottoman barracks. Wives of military leaders served wine to the officers who butchered their husbands. Some women were deliberately placed in positions where death was slow and public. Locked in iron cages, hung from city gates, they were left to starve in sight of their own people. Their torment dragged on for days, each hour a demonstration of the price of resistance. The darkest fate was reserved for women who bore children of fallen leaders. The Ottomans feared bloodlines, feared that one day a son might rise to reclaim his father's name. So they cut the lineage at its root. Infants were torn from mothers, sold or executed. A mother forced to watch the killing of her child understood immediately that even the shadow of resistance wouldn't be allowed to survive. Torture was methodical. Officers employed psychological cruelty alongside physical torment. Women were forced to choose between their children, one spared, one killed, shattering their loyalty forever. All of this was written down, every act, every punishment. The Ottomans documented horror like accountants tallying profits. It was proof of power, but the cruelty went further. Some women were used as weapons of conquest, sent back to their own cities under Ottoman control to spread obedience. They walked as puppets, their survival tied to betraying their past. There were experiments in degradation. Some women were starved, then paraded with food dangling just out of reach. Others were forced into fights against one another, gladiator-like spectacles staged for soldier entertainment. The empire didn't just want obedience, it wanted entertainment. Human suffering became sport. Women who refused conversion were dragged into mosques and beaten until they whispered the words of the Shahada. Their broken voices became evidence of submission. For those who still resisted, deaths were made slow, turned into drawn-out sermons on the futility of defiance. Perhaps the most chilling punishment was silence. Some women were erased not by death or torture, but by complete disappearance. They were taken into secret chambers, confined for years, allowed no contact with the outside world. They didn't live, they didn't die. They simply ceased to exist. Ghosts swallowed by the empire's machinery. Communities never forgot the images burned into their minds. Wives of leaders mutilated, mothers watching infants slaughtered, sisters dragged screaming through streets. Survivors carried torment into every breath, haunted by screams, bodies that never healed, minds shattered by impossible choices. Fear traveled faster than armies. Cities surrendered not because walls collapsed, but because word spread of what awaited the women inside. The Ottomans didn't need to fight every battle. Sometimes the screams of the conquered were enough to force the next city to open its gates. The empire didn't consider this cruelty a crime. It was law. Every act was legitimized through doctrine and bureaucracy. Judges, scribes, and officials blessed the suffering. The system wasn't rogue violence. It was sanctioned, organized, legal. The destruction of these women wasn't just tolerated. It was celebrated as order, as civilization, as empire. This is why the story doesn't end in the past. It lingers, it echoes. Because once a system proves that absolute domination can be dressed as law, it sets a precedent. The Ottoman system became a template for empire-wide control replicated across continents and centuries. The wives of defeated warriors were the foundation of a legacy of exploitation that outlived them. What became of the ones completely erased? The women who vanished into silence, into archives, into graves without names. Their stories aren't written. Their fates aren't known. The darkest truth may be the one we'll never uncover. This is why the story of what the Ottomans did still echoes today. Not because of how these women lived, but because of how completely they were erased.